Welcome back to Unveiling Islam. David Wood here with Brother Rachid. And Brother Rachid, I'm sure you've heard this before. It's not as common as it used to be, fortunately. But back when I started hearing about you and some of the Arab-speaking Christians who were criticizing Islam, it was very, very, very common. It was pretty much the standard position of many Christian churches that under no circumstances should you be criticizing Muhammad or the Quran in your discussions with Muslims. What they would say is, if you criticize Muhammad or the Quran to a Muslim, he's never going to listen to you again. He'll hate you. He's never going to listen to the gospel. And Christians are actually teaching this when they're dealing with evangelism to Muslims. And I was listening to this and I was thinking, this goes against everything in my experience.
Totally. It's not biblical either. Let's start somewhere. Should we criticize Islam if we're dealing with Muslims? Well, as I said, the Bible, if we look at Jesus, he engaged in heated discussions with religious leaders, and he criticized their doctrines, whatever they believed, their worldviews, their standards, their ethics, everything around them. He criticized that, and sometimes in a very harsh language. So if you think we shouldn't do that, then you have a serious problem dealing with Jesus when he did that with Jewish leaders. Mm-hmm. That's first. Second, if you engage in a discussion with a Muslim, everything you think you have as a Christian, he has a copy of it. And the only way to distinguish between the two is you put it on the spot and criticize it. For example, if you talk about God, he believes in God. If you talk about prophets, he believes in prophets. If you talk about the Torah and the gospel, he believes in the Torah and the gospels. If you talk about Jesus, he believes in Jesus. Prayer, he has a prayer. Fasting, he has fasting. Salvation, he has some kind of salvation. So what are you going to do? Just preach and say, if you tell anything, he will say, yeah, we have that. Mm-hmm. And you will be forced at certain moment to compare the two and tell them this is the truth and this is not the truth. The other problem, I have been told, not only you, even until today I still hear this, we should only preach the love of Christ. And it's sufficient, it will change people. I have no problem against it. But I have a problem with only. Mm-hmm. You can preach the gospel. The gospel is powerful, changes people.
Yeah. So if a Christian were to say, "Hey, I just preach the gospel. I just emphasize Jesus," like I would say, "Oh, okay, that's fine." But they don't. They say this is the only way to do things.
The only way, and not only that, they believe that we are doing something sinful. We are doing something against the Bible. I say, even Jesus himself, he didn't go everywhere just preaching himself. Mm-hmm. He had to deal with people. He had to deal with their sins, their teachings, whatever they are doing. He had to deal with it. So even Jesus, he didn't preach Jesus everywhere. So when we deal with a Muslim, and he tells you Muhammad is the way, is the prophet, is the perfect human being on this earth, what are you going to do? Just ignore that and talk about Jesus? He will be like, no, I mentioned Muhammad.
Yeah, and the reason I said this went completely counter to my experience was a lot of my early engagement with Islam was just my friend Abil. Yeah. But he's giving arguments. He's saying, look, the Quran's been perfectly preserved, and look at all these scientific miracles in the Quran, and look how great Muhammad was, and so on. Like, how do you even respond to that without criticizing what's being said? But we had discussions for about 4 years. And probably the first 2.5 years, we were focusing almost completely on Christian topics. So, did Jesus die on the cross? Did he rise from the dead? Is he divine? The Trinity, the reliability of the New Testament. We're talking about topics like that. And Then we started focusing on his arguments, like has the Quran been perfectly preserved? Is Muhammad as good as he thinks he is, and so on. We started looking into these kinds of issues. And it was only after those things where he eventually became a Christian. But he eventually told me that when we're examining the evidence for Christian beliefs, he eventually told me, he said, when we actually went into the details and into the history, he said, I was actually thinking Christians have good evidence for what they believe. He said, Christians have good evidence for belief in Jesus' death, in his resurrection, in his claims to be the divine Son of God. He said, I could see that Christians actually had good evidence for that. He said, but what I was thinking in my head was, but even if they show me with 99% certainty that their claims are true, I'm still 100% sure that Islam is true because of the scientific miracles and the perfect preservation, because of how great Muhammad is. And so that's the reason he had 100% confidence. And it's not until you show that those beliefs are actually flawed and false and based upon deception that he was even able to take the gospel seriously.
David, we cannot build on a wrong base if you don't have a good base. Imagine a house of Islam is already built, and you're just trying to build upon that house. You have to tear down that first one, then you can build a new one. You cannot just ignore it and pretend it doesn't exist. And that's why we have to deal with Islam. Islam has claims against Christianity. You cannot just ignore them. It has claims that the Bible was corrupt. It has claims that Jesus never died. It has claims that the Trinity is wrong. It has claims that Christians are polytheists. They are worshiping a man and they elevated him to a status of a divine person. They have many claims against Christianity. To ignore that and just preach the love of Christ is like suicidal in the world of ideas. So you have at certain moment to come to a conclusion and say, I think this is where comes the objection. We want to be politically correct. We don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. They will be like, no, you will hurt their feelings. Well, guess what? Truth hurts. Do you think Jesus didn't hurt anybody's feelings when he was dealing with Jews? Yes. I was hurt when I was listening to Christians and defending their faith and responding to my questions through letters. I was hurt, and I was challenged, and I was mad, and I insulted, and I said things. But that was the way so I can get challenged and change. There is no change without being challenged. So when we think we will not hurt them, we will not say things that will offend them, I say always you can do it with two pillars. One of them, say the truth, say it plainly. Second, love them, show them love. So this is the balance. Some people are trying to ignore truth. They are trying to show love, but at the expense of truth.
And that's one of the biggest problems nowadays is people think if you hurt someone's feelings, you're not being loving.
Yeah.
And that's ridiculous. Sometimes your feelings need to be hurt. And if you look at Jesus, if Jesus is talking to the scribes and Pharisees, if you look throughout the Bible, the biggest targets of like open rebuke were like hypocritical religious leaders and false teachers and so on.
Yeah.
So guess what? Muhammad is the supreme example of that. So if anyone is deserving of criticism, biblically, that would be someone like Muhammad. So biblically, it seems like that, but people have absorbed this idea that it's unloving to hurt feelings. It's like, was Jesus unloving when he was rebuking the scribes and Pharisees? I would say that was completely loving because he was telling them what they needed to hear.
Exactly. And listen to this, Dave. How Muslims interpret a Christian being silent about Islam. It's not the way how a Christian interprets it. Yeah. We see it as a weakness. We see they don't have a logical response to it. That we have the strongest argument, we have the strongest worldview, and they cannot challenge it. So they have to be aware to that. The way how we are wired is like they are afraid of us, and that's why they cannot say anything about Islam.
Yeah, so in other words, Christians are trying to be nice to show how loving they are, and that's being completely misinterpreted by their Muslim friends as weakness and lack of confidence.
Yes.
And lack of true belief. And so you're being nice, and it's actually encouraging them to believe that they've got the superior idea. You know what's interesting is every time I've tried to trace, like, where are churches getting this idea that you don't criticize Muhammad or you don't criticize the Quran, there were kind of two sources. One of the sources of that there were Christian missionaries from Muslim countries who were saying, then training churches saying, hey, don't criticize Muhammad or the Quran. I get it for them, but they're coming and training people who aren't in that environment to do the same thing.
And time changed. You are not there anymore.
Yeah, we're not there anymore. The other source, so I get that. The other source was Muslim leaders telling Christians, guys, don't ever criticize Muhammad or the Quran. That will just drive a Muslim. Like, they're giving you brilliant ideas about how to effectively evangelize Muslims, right?
And let me tell you this, like, through Islam, 1400 years, people were silenced. Nobody challenged Islam. It's until nowadays that the challenge is open. It's everywhere. You can read it. We thought Islam is superior, and that's why nobody can challenge. But actually, we spread fear. We spread censorship. Nobody can talk. Even books, they were not allowed in. We couldn't read any worldview that will challenge Islam. Now, with internet, with everything, Islam is exposed, and we have to do our part as Christians.
And so these are actually very good times. And just from my personal experience, I don't have official statistics, but I would say, just based on my personal experience, probably somewhere between 90 and 95% of the people that I've heard from who have left Islam only left Islam after their beliefs were criticized. So if someone tells you, do not under any circumstances criticize Muhammad or the Quran, don't listen to that person unless they're aware of something that we just don't, because experience and the Bible tell us something completely different.